Hello and welcome to another episode of Liberty Dad. Normally, I reserve Wednesday night for either Dad Talk, where I bring on dads to talk about whatever they want to discuss, or myself, I talk about things that related to being a dad. What started out as a sharp swipe on Twitter became a sort of a challenge. Can Liberty Dad have a longer conversation and engage in good faith on a topic that he feels pretty strongly about? Well, tonight we are going to find out. Joining me tonight is Britt. Our paths crossed recently when he tweeted out, "Can we focus on stopping the genocide of trans people, please?" And then I responded sharply saying, well, if only places like Rwanda and Bosnia knew about real genocide. A few more exchanges later, and here we are to discuss, is there a trans genocide occurring? Tonight, we will discuss the matter as simply two people with strong views. It won't necessarily be a debate as we have no moderator, so we're going to have to keep it at the level of a simple conversation. Now, many of you may object and say, but DL, it's obvious there's no trans genocide and it's offensive to even entertain the idea. Well, my response is to remind my audience that I previously have argued that libertarians should, and already do, engage in the culture war, and that our engagement is necessary to show the world around us that libertarians have ideas that don't require government force to solve these modern problems. Without in some way responding to these ideas we may find absurd or offensive, then others are left to consume whatever is presented. Consider this. If you do a search for trans genocide, you might find yourself surprised at how much conversation has already occurred. While prepping for the episode, I watched a 30-minute video on YouTube titled Trans Genocide in America Explained. This video was published about 2 months ago and has roughly 85,000 views, over 7,000 likes, and about 1,500 comments. I think that makes this conversation worth having. So with that, let's get Zach in here. Zach, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing wonderful. Happy Flag Day. Yeah.
You say Flag Day or Flag Day?
Flag Day, yes.
Flag Day. Let me turn my audio up because I'm getting old, you know? So I guess it is Flag Day. I am notoriously terrible about keeping up with what day it is. Half the time my company is like, hey, you're supposed to be off work because it's a company holiday. And I'm like, oh, I was not aware. So let's see. Let's get some names up on here. And there we go. All right. So let me get a little situated with my windows here. I got them all over the place. And then we will get started. But while I'm doing that, for people that may not know who you are,
Sure.
kind of just give your elevator pitch of who you are and why everybody must absolutely hear what you got to say.
Sure. My name is Zach Britt, obviously. I'm 22 years old. I go to Mississippi State University. I'm involved in several activist organizations like the Bulldog Leftist Union. And I do work with the College Dems, and I also do work with Progressive Victory. I generally have a sort of a libertarian background. I was involved in the Libertarian Party for a number of years, since 2017 all the way up until about a year ago. I sympathize with a few libertarian ideals and generally want to push the pendulum towards liberty. So, yeah.
All right. Awesome. Well, that sounds great. And the audience probably knows who I am. No super duper introduction necessary from me. Let's start off with a couple of things. I don't know who's going to jump on the stream. I don't know who's going to jump into the comments. In the past, I've had some touchy topics. In fact, this very topic, actually, the topic of trans. And I've had some pretty nasty people, some people say some pretty nasty things. So just let you know, I ignore them and ask that you ignore them as well. No need for us to worry about, people. I mean, if they're not going to, my opinion is if somebody doesn't say it to your face, it's probably not worth worrying about. So a lot of tough guys. I'm a bit on the older side. I'm literally twice as old as you. And when I was growing up, when I was your age, I don't know what it's like anymore, but we kind of knew that the people that ran their mouth the most were also the first ones to run when things hit. So I don't worry about anybody that may or may not jump into the comments and saying, pretty mean things. Now, if somebody does jump in and says something, we'll try to address it if it makes sense. I mean, sometimes people say things and it's not really what's what's going on with the conversation. So I may skip that. Or if you happen to see something, feel free to highlight it and say, hey, I'd like to, I'd like to address this question that I see in the audience. So you're more than welcome to jump on in there. Other than that, I think to get started, what got you and I even on this podcast was you said, I don't think you're going to have a conversation in good faith. And as I was kind of
Especially on Twitter,
oh,
particularly, like, Twitter's not really, like, a good place to have a good faith
no,
dialogue or
no.
long-form discussion. That's why I was typically not engaging with many people that replied in that thread, because I just felt
Right.
like it wasn't really gonna be productive, and
Mhm.
no matter what I said in Twitter, they were just gonna believe the same thing regardless, so there was
Right.
really no point,
Yeah, yeah,
essentially.
absolutely. And I mean, it's Twitter. Everybody acts like a fool on Twitter, including me.
Including me,
So,
yeah.
but what I wanted to do, because I've watched some of these debates in the libertarian community before, where like, oh, these two guys coming together, whoever, these two people coming together to debate a particular topic, and then everybody walks away, and they're like, and there's no sense of was it productive or not. So maybe this will help out. We'll try something new. So, do you suppose, for the purposes of this episode, we're not on Twitter anymore, what would make you walk away? What would leave you saying, you know what, I'm glad I had that conversation, right? Other than obviously, like, man, he changed all his ideas to my idea. Obviously, that would be that's the crowning achievement, right? But like lower than that, if we end up
Um,
walking away not agreeing, what's going to make you at least feel like, hey, you know what, I was heard, and I'm glad I went on the podcast.
that's a fair question. I think if we're able to both, I guess, engage in good faith, basically, not, yell and scream at each other, allow other people to, like, get their points across, go point by point, don't, like, gish gallop, stuff like that. I don't know. I'm not necessarily sure that either of us are going to be able to, like, significantly change either person's minds in a
Mhm.
significant way. But other than that, I think that's, I don't know, just have a good talk,
Okay.
chill.
Okay. I figured that maybe we do that, and just kind of say like, hey, maybe this will be kind of like our standard. And that way we both can walk away. I'm like, it was a productive conversation because we achieved at least the bare minimum of what we hope to. Okay, so awesome. I'm gonna, if you're okay with it, I'll start with the infographic that you presented me, and I'll put that
Oh,
up
yeah.
on the screen if you want. Did you bring any of your? Sorry for the folks for the adjustment of the microphone. I decided that I didn't like how far it was.
That's the only, like, physical image that I would have wanted to,
Okay.
possibly discuss. Other than that,
Okay.
that's
Okay.
the only image.
Um, Fair enough. And if something comes to mind and we can find it quickly, we can do that too. That's fine. Let's see here. So let's move some screens around, and then let's see here. I got my camera in the way, so I can't see things. Hold on. It's very difficult being a one-man band here. So present, and then we are going to share the screen. And now we want to do this one. There we go. I think we've got it now. So it should be up on the screen. Perfect. There it is. All right. So I may move this around just a wee bit so I can, let's see, is that the best we can do? I guess that is the best we can do. Can you see it well enough?
Oh, yeah, and I have it written down, so I know
Okay.
what it is.
Okay. Perfect. That's the biggest I can make it, folks. So hopefully it's working out for you. But I can see it over here. So I believe, and I don't have the tweet pulled up, but I believe you presented this and you said, hey, look, this is kind of like evidence that there's a genocide. And
Right.
I believe you said we're on number 4. Is that correct?
I can probably point to about, like, 6 of these stages that,
Okay.
are relevant to the topic of trans people. I mainly posted this graphic in the thread because a lot of people, including you, were saying, "Oh, trans people aren't literally being killed on the streets by agents of the state," in which case you are correct. That's currently not happening, at least not yet, right?
Mhm.
So this is kind of a way of saying this isn't the only way that genocides can happen. If you look at any of these stages and you can say that it applies to trans people, well, these are warning signs, like, hey, a genocide either is happening or it's about to happen, right? This is written by this guy named Gregory H. Stanton, who is the president of Genocide Watch. So
Mhm.
someone very familiar on the topic of genocide, and these are the stages he's laid out.
Okay. So you said the first 6 or just 6, like 6 different ones?
6 different ones, so I would say 1 through 4, and then
Okay.
6 and 7 are applicable to this case.
Okay. And I'm going to pull it up on my because I'm having a little bit trouble. I got my camera in front of the other screen so I can make it look like I'm looking directly at people, and it's not working out so well. So give me just a moment. I'm going to pull up the actual graphic on this other monitor right in front of me. Okay, perfect. So there we go. So now I can see it a little bit better. And you said 6 and 7. We're skipping 5, and then 1 through 4.
Right.
Okay.
And that's not to say that other stages can't be applied. It's just those are the only ones that I'm confident in, applying to trans people.
Okay. So these are the 10 stages, and I let's start with walking through them. Will that work for you?
Hell yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So I'm going to walk through them, and because this is set in an order, so typically, so when you research genocide, so first of all, genocide is a very, very specific definition. It actually was created very specifically in regards to the Holocaust, and considering some of the other genocides, Rwanda, like I mentioned, with the Hutu and the Tutsis, and then also Bosnia, where you had, I think there was 3 different groups there where that were clashing, and then other places in the world as well. And so the idea was to kind of give some reference for how does it get to that point, right? How does it get to because as several scholars have said, you don't wake up one day and then just it was literally everything was fine yesterday, but today there are ashes of people floating by your window. That's not how it happened. So that's the purpose of this particular graphic. So I want to kind of walk back, because in my mind, if you said all 10 of them are true, well, then I would say, okay, well, let's look at 10. Do we see, can we agree on 10? Can we agree on 9? Can we agree on 8? And if we get down to 1 where we say, okay, well, maybe not so much, then maybe the idea that this is applicable isn't so. Does that make sense?
I'm following the line there. Yeah.
Okay. So that's kind of why I want to walk backwards through it. And that's what I was doing. Now, I
Okay.
think, to hold you a little accountable, on Twitter, I believe you said we're on stage 4. So, and you didn't mention 6 or 7. So I didn't really read through 6 or 7. So we're going to be kind of doing this ad hoc,
Okay.
and fine, no big deal. So we'll look at 7. It says perpetrators plan the genocide. Okay. So now they're planning a specific event. They often use euphemisms such as the Nazis' phrase, the final solution, to cloak their intentions. Acts of genocide are disguised as self-defense if there is an ongoing armed conflict or civil war, such as Bosnia. So tell me how stage 7 in your mind applies to the trans community right now.
Well,
And
there's a specific.
by the way, can I interrupt real quick before you go?
Sure, go for it.
Do you consider yourself to be trans as well?
No, I'm a cisgender man, he, him pronouns,
Okay. Okay. So you would just be an ally.
For sure, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a specific example in Texas where the attorney general has created a registry of all transgender people in the state. So whether people who are changed their gender on their licenses or people who have sought to acquire gender affirming care. So these are all being placed on a registry. Who knows what the state might do with that information, but the fact is they're registering individuals who are trans, essentially. Yeah.
Okay. So is that really any different than me having my sex on there, that I'm a male? Because if I don't, it says male, my wife has female on there. It says,
Right, so you wouldn't be on the
it has other,
registry because you haven't changed it, essentially.
I'm sorry.
They're acquiring lists of people who have changed their gender on their licenses. So someone who
So you're saying this is an
switched.
additional database,
Well, they're yes, yes,
or maybe not a database, but it's an additional compilation of information somehow that stands out uniquely from what's currently on the driver's license. Is that what you're saying?
yes.
Okay. I can't speak to it 'cause
Specifically targeting trans people.
okay. And what is the stated purpose for this?
I don't believe there is a stated purpose. I think it's very ambiguous,
Okay, so they just said we're going to start documenting who is trans.
essentially.
Okay. And so 7
It,
says they've planned it and they use euphemisms like the final solution.
mhm,
And then
often used.
acts of genocide are disguised as self-defense. So I'm not really seeing where a list of people falls into stage 7. Is it a different stage?
Um, uh, it says often use euphemisms, so they don't have to use the euphemisms, right? And this is a stage, so it's not like we can look back on history and say this is how they planned it, and this is what happened. This is
Mhm.
just an example of what may be planned. Essentially, I'm not too like this isn't a concrete where this is genocide. This is sort of an example of what could be perceived as a stage of genocide.
Okay. And I'm telling you, I'm having a little trouble seeing it because what I'm seeing here are euphemisms. So,
Right.
phrases, names, something like that, right? Some in euphemisms usually are more of a phrase um, that kind of indicate what you're going to do. That what you have planned in mind.
Well,
And we haven't stated in here. We just said that, hey, you have to document who you actually are. So there's no euphemism there. We're saying, like, if you identify as trans, you need to specifically have that on your driver's license. And then it says that they will, and so the intent of the euphemism is to cloak an intention. So, but there's no euphemism here. And there's no active genocide, at least not by collecting information in itself, even if I would, by the way, disagree with collecting information.
right. I mean, it's specifically targeting transgender people, so it's people who um this is a directive from the attorney general, so he's telling his office to acquire a list of trans individuals, right? And these are people who are just living their lives as trans, so they
Mhm.
don't really necessarily need the attorney general Ken Paxton knowing their gender identity for any other purpose other than to target them individually. That
Okay.
there's really no other reason why he would need that information.
Okay. And don't get me wrong. I disagree with I think the government ought not have a lot of information that they already have, much less anymore. Okay. So there's no disagreement there on whether or not the government needs to have certain information. They don't. Right. But the
Mhm.
question is, does it fall within this category of preparation? And
It could.
and I'm really not seeing the argument here because, again, there's no euphemism. We're not trying to hide some intention here. The governor or whoever, the attorney general said, let's document who people really are. There is no euphemism. They're not trying to stealthily, they're not saying, all right, I want you to document, and instead of writing trans, I want you to write down this other term. And then we'll say it's one thing, but what it's really doing is another thing. So that would be a little bit more likely in this particular scenario, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat what you just said? I'm sorry.
What I was kind of walking through it, and I was saying, if it was if there was a euphemism or even an intent to hide some intention, right, some future action,
Mhm.
um, then you might see something more like the attorney general, rather than saying, hey, document all the trans people, but don't put trans down. I want you to put something else down. And that'll be like our little key code. Like, we know what that really means. And we'll tell everybody else it means something else, right? That would be more of like a euphemism of like hiding some intention. And so what I'm trying to get at here is, in under the stage 7 for preparation, it is explicitly saying that in this stage is where somebody is using coded language to hide some ulterior motive. But
Mhm.
the example that you gave me, which might fit in another bubble, that's fine. I don't know. Maybe it will. But the example you gave me was, hey, we're documenting people. And I don't know that documenting necessarily, well, I mean, it can lead to genocide, but the problem that we have, at least in this country, is that everything is documented. It's like we're documented like crazy. So I think that raises the bar on what does it mean to suggest that this is part of like these stages of genocide, because everything is getting documented. Like, the
Right.
government's trying to scoop up all kind, and hopefully they're not trying to genocide us all, right? So we can't just say, well, the mere fact that they're collecting information is a sign of genocide, because that's what they've been doing for, like, I don't know how long, right? Like, that's all they do these days.
Right. And I think without the context of history, we can't exactly prove one way or the other whether there or not this is preparation for anything,
Mhm.
especially because I mean under the stage it says they're uses euphemisms to hide their intentions. These intentions are pretty much hidden. I mean, it's not like Ken Paxton was saying, "Hey, let's keep track of all these trans people so we can go after them and like, if they're getting gender affirming care, taken from their parents, stuff like that." It's not like they're actually doing that in Texas right now. Um, but,
Right.
but but yeah,
Okay. So we're not in agreement on stage 7. Like we're not coming to any kind of term, and that's fine. We don't have to keep arguing and try to win each other over on that. That's fine. What we want to do is we want to talk this out, and I want to hear what you have to say, and then I'm going to give you my thoughts. And you're more. And by the way, I talk a lot. Jump right on in. Don't
okay,
don't feel bad. Okay. Because otherwise I'll just keep talking. So unless you got more to say on 7, let's maybe move on to stage 6.
that sounds good. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so polarization. Propaganda begins to be spread by hate groups. The Nazis used the newspaper, and I don't do German, but Der Stürmer, to spread and incite messages of hate about Jewish people. So now, in this particular case, here's going to be the biggest sticking point when we go into the whole thing, is that on this particular document, it's going to refer to like the Nazis and other authority entities, right? Entities of authority, because I think in some countries, maybe you just had like rebel groups and whatnot. So it wasn't necessarily the formal government itself. But in Germany, it was certainly the formal government. Okay. Um, I'm going to go with it and just be a little flexible and say, like, we can step outside of the bounds of a formal government or a formal entity if we can establish that, like there's something more concrete. Do
Right.
you follow me on that?
Yeah, because the Nazis weren't necessarily doing this just when they got power. They didn't gain power and then say, "Oh yeah, the Jews are doing this and LGBT people are doing this." They were spreading propaganda before they were even close to power, and that's how they
Sure.
gained it.
Sure. So we got the propaganda begins to spread by hate groups, and then Nazis use the newspaper. So do we have, what is your sample? What is your example of this?
I mean, you can just look anywhere. I mean, social media is full of outlets that are promoting propaganda against trans people, whether be calling them groomers or pedophiles or stuff like that.
Okay.
Um,
So are these in any way formal organizations that have the power to do anything other than just simply spread a message?
I don't think having power is necessary for spreading propaganda. I mean, propaganda can be spread in multiple ways.
Well,
Um,
I understand that, but you can't polarize somebody
there,
if you don't have a bit of power, right? You
right.
can't polarize one group against another if you don't have the power. Like little
The,
old me, I could say whatever I want about you. That doesn't mean that anybody's gonna like come after you.
well, for sure, but there are popular people that have an audience that
Mhm.
have the power to spread a message that are saying things against the trans community.
Okay, such as
Well, I mean, Michael Knowles, for example, he said he wants transgenderism to be eradicated from public life entirely. He said
okay,
this. He said this at CPAC, which is like one of the largest conservative um, conservative conferences in the entire country. These people, including the former president, have spoken at this conference. So it's not like he is saying this just to an individual. He's speaking this to a large audience of people to thunderous applause.
okay. And did he have any? Was it pretty well received? Like not just within his own group, but just in general, or did he at any time receive any pushback?
He received pushback, but it wasn't from conservatives. It wasn't from his audience.
Okay, but it was from other people that were within the same domain, right? Because remember, if we're looking at like say if we're looking at Nazi Germany, right? Nazi Germany was pretty much contained for the most part, like within Nazi Germany. You didn't have like
Well, I
trying
mean,
to think. I mean, it did spread out. Let me
they were
try
they were
to
fascist movements all across Europe at the same
correct.
time.
Correct. But what I'm saying is like in Nazi Germany, you largely had a group of people that had power that were spreading messages and they were very intentional about spreading those messages. And you didn't necessarily have other groups that could simply rise up and say, you know what? No, this is a terrible idea. This is not happening. So for instance, and I agree with you, there are some conservatives that are saying some pretty horrible things. I no question about that. I've seen some of them. I've responded to some of them myself. However, also within this own very country, we have a lot of groups that have spoken out and said, okay, you're going way too far with that. Or even saying, hey, you're a terrible bigot, right? I mean, we just literally had the White House drop a pride flag right in front of the, right in the, right in the very front there. And like it, there was lots of howling, but it remained there, right?
Sure.
Like, and so what I'm getting at is, to me, when I go back and I read in history, I don't see where you have these counter movements, because I do agree that there are people that say things like that, that's not arguable, right? Like, people say things, and sometimes some people have large audiences, um, and sometimes they get a little bit of traction. But the question is, does it rise to the level where we are looking at an actual genocide? And my read of history says that when you see what's going on with the genocide, you don't see the counter movements to those. You don't see, like, there's the classical liberal caucus. I'm sure that they scream at everything that they see along that line, right? I don't know how many there are in that particular group. I know I have criticized a number of people for some of the things that they've said. You have this huge body of people. So what I'm trying to establish here is, how does polarization in this particular case, as it's defined here, how does it apply today in the context where we're looking at a genocide?
Right. So these people that are saying these things aren't just ordinary people. They have both influence and power. I mean, there are several state legislatures in the country that are Republican controlled, that are passing laws against trans people on top of this rhetoric that's being thrown around. Um, are you suggesting that because there are people who are speaking out against the people that are saying these things, that somehow that means that there isn't a genocide? Because as far as I'm aware, in Nazi Germany, there were people speaking out against the genocide.
So so at the very foundation, I look and I say, I don't believe that there is a genocide occurring. I don't believe we're even close to a genocide occurring. Now,
Can you
what
can you at least acknowledge that there is propaganda being spread by hate groups?
sure, there's all kind of propaganda. There's propaganda that I
That's
think is
stage 7.
terrible.
There we go. Verse 6.
So, um, but we've always had propaganda. I mean, if you look back early in the country, there was propaganda especially around like our elections. There was all kind of propaganda about various candidates, and trying to stir the masses up. Propaganda has been around since forever. I don't think you're going to find a time when there wasn't propaganda. So
Sure.
we have to evaluate and say, okay, when does the propaganda have the power and rise to the level that is a genocide? Now, I'm kind of doing this backwards, which may be causing a little bit more consternation than necessary, because what normally happens is you and I would first try to figure out a definition of what does it mean to what is a genocide? What does it mean? Right? What's the definition? And
Sure.
more than likely, that definition would probably either end the conversation or start all the debates, right? Like, that would be, because, like, if you and I agreed upon a definition and said, okay, well, this definition says, we agree on this definition. Yes, it is. Okay, well, then, is that what's going on? Yes, it is. Okay, well, then there's genocide, or no, that's not. Okay, no, there's no, so it could end quickly. But I knew that wasn't going to happen. And I figured, let's just start with this, because maybe it would be a little bit more interesting. Right. So I'm trying to do things a little different here. I don't know. I'm just kind of winging it. So, but I agree, there is propaganda. I agree that there are people out there that are saying mean and nasty, horrible things. I even would agree that there are people that are doing mean and nasty things, right? But I also agree that all of those have always occurred to some group, one way or another, right? When I was growing up, it wasn't trans kids, because I don't even think anybody knew the idea of trans at all when I was growing up, or if they did, it was just barely, right? So we had conversations about overweight kids, or the little scrawny kid, which was kind of me,
Right.
or
I
whatever.
I guess the way I would push back against this is, like, it's not just mean people saying mean things. It's a concerted effort across the country by conservative politicians, pundits, and outlets to promote this idea that trans people are evil. They're going against children, things like that. I mean, that happened in Nazi Germany, right? It wasn't just like Nazis gained power and then they said mean things. It was a concerted effort, right? They used and they even used the same language against the LGBT community too, right? Because let's not forget, LGBT people were killed in the Holocaust. They were put in camps in the Holocaust, right?
Correct.
They used words to describe LGBT people, like what's this word? It is the corrupter of youth is the word, is what the word meant, and that's
Mhm.
similar. You can see groomer, right? It's they're saying the same thing.
Right.
It's essentially the
And
point that I'm trying to make.
right. And I don't disagree. People do say, like, it's been a sticking point for me that people use on both sides, left and right. They use language very loosely and, in my opinion, very sloppily. Right? People just throw out the term
It's
groomer.
intentional, I'd say.
Yeah, it is. They throw out the term groomer. They throw out the term bigot. They throw out the term pedophile. They throw out the term racist. It's been going on and on since as long as I could remember. And both sides, at this point, it's happened so much that I just look at it and I say both sides are equally guilty. I don't know. Maybe there's one side that does it more, but at this point, I've heard it so much from both sides. I'm like, what? I just can't tell anymore. Right, because both of y'all are doing it. This is one of the reasons why you will almost never see me use the term groomer or the term pedophile, or unless well, I don't want to say it is almost never. And when I do, I'm very, very specific in a very, very narrow edge case, right? Like I just don't throw it out very loosely like that.
Yeah, because something like that, and it's why they're using the word, right?
Mhm.
Something like that can cause violence to be perpetrated against the person, right? And that's kind of the whole like crux of why I believe this stage is happening, right? Because in this country, being trans or pro-trans, there are people who believe you are in support of pedophiles. People look at, like, for example, Maj Toure, like he saw the trans flag and was like, this is the flag of pedophiles. When obviously it's not. It's the trans flag, right? It's not the map flag. Um, and
I
when
saw that, yeah, and
and
I
when
would
you
disagree.
combine this with rhetoric that pedophiles should be attacked, killed, whether it be by the state or by vigilantes, you are suggesting that trans people or people who support trans people should be attacked or killed because they're groomers and pedophiles, when this is obviously not the case. It's perpetrating violence against people just because they're trans, which is this stage of genocide, I'd say.
Okay. So I tell you what, I'll agree on this particular, not necessarily the stage six, but I will agree that there is a significant amount. We'll even call it disproportionate, a disproportionate amount of language, that's rhetoric, that's being used against the trans community. And when I say disproportionate, I mean disproportionate to the size of the group. Okay. Because I think there's a lot more that's being said about the group than there are actually. It's like, if you counted all the times that people said, pedophiles and groomers, you'd have like, 100
Right.
times more alleged people than actually even physically exist, right? Like something like that. I mean, those are just kind of, made up numbers, but you see what I'm getting at? Like,
Yeah.
I just think that it's so used at this point. But see, this is part of, this can be a consistent objection of mine. And I'll get accused of whataboutism, but I don't think it is, because I look and I say, well, I remember not too long ago when everybody was a Nazi, which is kind of still the same, actually. Like, everybody's a Nazi. And there was a movement like, hey, it's okay to punch a Nazi. And I said, no, it's not okay to punch a Nazi. So in my mind, it's not okay to punch a Nazi. And it's not okay to go and attack somebody that you believe is a pedophile, right? Like neither one of those are okay. And so the sticking point that I have is not like, hey, they did it, so it's okay. It's been done repeatedly for different groups. And so what I want to see is, how does this particular group, at what point does it stand out any different than any other group has had to experience, right? Because if you're going to say, well, yes, it happens to trans people and it also happens to people that are not Nazis, um, but it's genocide on the trans people, then the question is, why is it not a genocide for other groups who have experienced similar behavior, regardless of their political leaning?
Like, so you're saying, like, because people were saying, like, punch Nazis, that's the same thing as saying trans people are groomers, so insinuating that we should attack them. That's a connection you're making there? I mean,
No, what I'm
I don't
saying
know.
is this group over here has it experienced harsh rhetoric, and sometimes
Sure.
and sometimes violence. And then so that's group A. Then group B has also experienced very nasty rhetoric, and they've also experienced potential violence as well. And so then you say, well, group B is experiencing a genocide. And I say, well, why? And you say, well, because of the rhetoric and the violence. And I said, well, does that same genocide term apply to group A or any
Is
other group that has experienced nasty rhetoric and potential violence?
is there any law in the books preventing Nazis from being Nazis?
Well, in Germany there are.
Oh, well, yeah, of course. Yeah, they have a bad
In
history of that.
Germany there are.
Yeah.
In Germany there are, and I don't know the status of hate crime laws, but if a Nazi were to get in a fight with a black person and start using racial epithets, right?
Right.
He's going to get
Get a hate crime.
accused
Yeah.
of being a hate crime,
Yeah.
even if they simply had a disagreement and he got angry and punched the guy and then started calling him names. In other words, even if the initial reason that they got in a fight had nothing to do with with hating the person, right? If it was something entirely different, and then he just so happened to get caught on record using slurs and whatnot, then he's gonna, so in a way, sort of, but there's not quite laws, but aren't there also equally laws that you can't assault either people, any group?
Right. Yeah. There's laws in the books that you can't attack people.
Right,
You can't
right.
use violence like that. Yeah. I mean,
And if I happen, so if I happen to beat somebody up and they're not trans, I'm probably just going to get, hit with whatever simple crime, right? I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. But if I beat somebody up and it turns out they're trans, the first thing they're going to look at is they're going to say, "Oh, is this a hate crime?" Right? And then they're going to start evaluating everything that was involved in that particular interaction between me and this person, right? And so if they find out that I was yelling, like "you pedo," blah blah blah, some other nasty things like that, then that's going to go toward a hate crime toward me, right?
mhm.
Okay. So we do have laws that protect trans, but you asked about laws that prohibit.
Nazis from being Nazis,
Right.
which there really isn't one
There
that I
isn't.
could point to.
But you kind of have this flip side where there's not a law that explicitly says you can't be a Nazi, but there are laws, or at least norms, that say you can't harm this person based on who they are. So it's not quite the same, but there's not a law that's against the Nazis, but there are laws that are in favor of certain groups, correct?
Shh.
So it's
There are laws in favor of certain groups. Yeah,
right,
I can
and
concede that bit, I
that
guess.
creates a bit of an imbalance, does it not? In favor of the trans individuals? Like let's
Well,
put it this
well,
way. I'm 20% Native American, right? Most people don't know that unless I tell them. Most people think that I'm some sort of weird off-white-ish kind of whatever, right? And so usually I just kind of pass for being white. So if somebody beats me up and that's it, they just beat me up, like I just got beat up, assault and battery, whatever, right? But if someone beats me up and they happen to know that I'm Native American and they say, they make some sort of joke, I'm not even sure what the slur would be, but if they make some sort of joke, while they're doing it, then they are actually going to be charged with additional penalties based on the attitude that was displayed while they were assaulting me. So I'm in this weird position where if I'm the white guy, in a sense, like I don't have those additional protections per se. But if I get to be the Native American guy, if that comes out through this transaction, if not transaction, but if it comes out through this action, then there's some additional. And so what I'm really kind of pointing at is like, no, there are. I'm going to say it just straight up because I like to give very clear answers to questions that I've been asked. Are there any laws that prevent somebody from being a Nazi? No, there are not. Not
mhm.
at least not to my knowledge. However, there are laws that could penalize a Nazi for engaging in certain attitudes while they're. You see what I'm saying? So it's not
I
just
see what you're
them,
saying for sure.
and those laws protect the minority group. So we're talking about, like, hey, all these laws are on the book, and don't get me wrong, we can circle back to, are there laws that are coming against trans people and LGBTQ and all that? We can address that one separately. But to address what we were talking about here is, the laws that that prevent somebody from being a Nazi. No, there are not.
Right.
But there are laws that somewhat protect people from being trans. And all of this I'm pointing out in this grand vision of mine where I say there isn't a genocide because there's too much going on in favor of the trans community. Even if there's simultaneously negative things happen, there's too much going on that's in favor that I did not see historically with any other group that has had a genocide. So to me, when I look at it, I say we have a very, very unique situation with the trans community, trans and LGBTQ, good Lord, I can't even say all the letters, but the trans and LGBTQ community, we have a very unique situation with them in this country. At least I can't speak for other countries, than what we've seen in Nazi Germany, than what we saw in Rwanda, than what we saw in Bosnia and other countries where we had very unmistakably clear genocides. So,
Right.
go.
The reason why I asked the question about, and you sort of already mentioned it, the reason why I asked the question about is there laws in the books preventing Nazis from being Nazis? Well, there isn't. Well, there are laws on the books preventing trans people from being trans. And this is we like I said, we can go through that as well. That's sort of the why I made that connection. There is a concerted effort when calling trans people in the trans community pedophiles and groomers, and it's to coincide with their laws attacking that community as well.
Mhm.
Like for the Nazi examples in the United States, at least there is no law preventing Nazis from being Nazis. Whereas
Right.
you can see some Antifa leftists on Twitter say punch Nazis, it's okay to punch Nazis. There is no legislative effort on the part of Democrats or whoever else to say criminalize people for being Nazis or for enabling like that. And for instance, you're not seeing like any sort of like liberal pundits or like Joe Biden or like MSNBC, for example, call for Nazis to be punched. Whereas on Fox News and stuff like that, you're seeing trans people being called pedophiles and groomers all the time, or
Right.
just the LGBTQ plus community in general. So that's why I would say that connection isn't really like there
Mhm.
because for those reasons.
Okay. And we were, just so that we don't lose our place, we're on stage 6. That's what we're talking about. And for anybody that's tuned in, maybe a little bit late, we are talking about the topic is a trans genocide happening? Zach is taking the position that it is. I'm taking the position that it isn't. And we are currently looking at the 10 stages of genocide, which is an infographic that Zach had presented to me on Twitter. This was kind of the initiation of our conversation. And at the very beginning of the show, Zach had said, look, I believe that stages 1 through 4 can be
Mhm.
presented along with stage 6 and 7. And then, but none of the rest, at least, or at least, those are the ones that he chose. And so what
Right.
we're doing is, for anybody that's tuning in, well, I'm walking backwards. And maybe I did this in the wrong order. I don't know. Maybe we should have simply started with like, hey, can we at least agree on what genocide means? And maybe that was the direction that maybe that would have been a more appropriate direction and made this conversation much more smooth. I don't really know, but I just
There are
figured
definitely other ways of looking at it for sure, of
Mhm.
looking at what a genocide is. And this isn't necessarily like, these are the steps that require there to be a genocide. These are just things that point to, if this is happening, it's a big warning sign. Hey, a genocide is happening,
Correct.
or it might happen.
Right.
Right. So the presence or absence of any of these things isn't necessarily saying that a genocide is or isn't happening. It's just, hey, might be happening.
That
So
is correct.
there are
So
there are other things that we could use that might be more concrete, I'd say.
there is
But
actually
I just
UN
I
has
I had
given
just
a very
I had
yeah,
just presented this graphic as a way of saying that genocide can manifest in different ways rather than just killing one group of people. And it's directly obvious that that's happening.
mhm. There actually is a document that we can look at that has the official definition of a genocide. It actually comes from the UN. Would you like to see it?
Oh hell yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so let's pull that up. Give me just a second. Let's see here. How do you switch documents here? I know you can do it. Um, Give me just a second. Okay, that wasn't how you do it. So let's see here. All right, let's try it this way. I know there was a way to switch it, and I switched it off by accident. So we will do this. All right. So now we have it up, and let me switch back my screens here. All right. And can you read it well enough, or do I need to make it a little bigger?
I can read it just fine.
Okay. I am trying to adjust my, this window doesn't seem to want to move here. There, I see what's going on.
I mean, particularly we want to look at the something below this, right? The list.
Yes. I was just trying to get my windows in order here. So we'll zoom it in just a wee bit so that we can see it. So this comes from the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So this is a UN document. It was approved in 1948, and to my knowledge, it has not yet, not ever been revised. Okay, so we go down here, and it actually the part that we're looking for is in Article 2.
Hmm.
It says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a
Hmm.
national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And then it has these 5 items: A, killing members of the group; B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group; C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part; D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group; and then E, forcibly transferring children of the group to
Hmm.
another group. Now, a couple things on this as I was doing some research. One of them is that uh, it is not required that all 5 of these apply.
Hmm.
So
Correct.
any one of these can apply.
Yeah, just point to just one, and then it's a
Right.
genocide. Yeah.
Now, what is my understanding, what is required, at least for the formal definition of a genocide, is this entire top part that I've got highlighted. Now, because it was written in 1948 and trans issues wasn't really a thing at that time, and this was dealing with Nazi Germany, and they were talking about, genocides at the time as they understood it. It does say only national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups, and so excludes any kind of sexuality or gender or anything like that. For the purposes of this conversation, we can look and just say, like, let's, like, I'm okay with bringing it in, right?
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
not the formal definition. I'm okay with including it. And the reason for that is because a lot of these kind of things have been updated. And when I was doing my research, there were people that were saying, "Hey, like, even people who opposed, there were scholars that were like, 'Hey, I'm a scholar. This is the kind of thing that I study.'" And trans, there's no trans genocide, is what some of these scholars were saying, right? And but then they would be asked, "Well, do you think we should update this document?" And they said, "I think that's worth a conversation." Right. So they were just kind of keeping to this strict reading of it as is, but open to the idea of, like, hey, maybe we can include it. And
Right.
since many documents have been updated, I see no reason to not update it, at least enough to have this conversation. Right. So we'll go. So you
Sure.
good with that?
I respect that. Even though I would say that the definition of ethnicity is like kind of like vague, where it's like, common cultural background. One could make the argument that trans people have a common cultural background, but that's so muggy and vague. So I respect that you're willing to acknowledge that, even though like even though you disagree with the fact that there is a trans genocide, that there could be a genocide against trans people, even if the definition doesn't fit like gender identity or sexual orientation or things like that.
Right. Um, so now let's take a look at it. Now, I was watching a video, and the particular person, it was the video that I mentioned, and when I introduced the show, and I don't have it up. I don't have it pulled up, but it was a trans individual, and they went and they did a like a 30-minute show where they were walking through, and they actually walked through this document here, and they were saying,
Hmm.
"Look, here's how I believe that not all 5 of them. I think they picked 3. I think they excluded 2 and said 3, or it might have been the other way around. They excluded 3 and then kept 2. I can't remember exactly at the
I
moment.
could also point to 3 of them. Yeah.
So, um, and now I know I disagreed with them, but they walked through this, and so that's, so there is an argument to be made. Whether or not I'll agree with it is another matter. Okay, so we walk through and we say killing members of the group. Well, it sounds on. I mean, I would imagine you agree on killing members of the group.
Not yet. At least that's not happening. No.
Okay,
Um,
because I know that there have been trans individuals who have been killed for being trans.
right. Like last year, there was like 36. So far this year, there's
Like,
there's there's been 7. So
Right. Right.
it is happening, but not to the extent where it would be it would fall under A for genocide. I'd say
Okay.
no.
So I find that curious. We'll get to that in a moment. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group.
That is absolutely happening. Yes.
Okay. C, and I'm going to write down just so I know which ones you selected. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in part or in whole or in part.
Yeah. In some states, that's happening.
Okay. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. I think that one's a
I
little bit hard.
don't believe that's happening. No.
Okay. I think that would be very, very difficult because the reality is, as far as we know, or for the most part, transgender individuals come from what you might call cisgender individuals. And so I don't think that there's no way to know like this person is going to birth who will become a transgender individual. Right. So it's not like a black person. Like if you say, all right, we're just going to wipe out all the black people. And then once we've wiped them out, then they can't reproduce. Like that kind of makes sense. We get that. Right. Like we understand. Sorry if you hear my son, he's
No, you're good.
knocking on the ground. This is part of being Liberty Dad. Sometimes he crashes the show. I and I locked the door hoping that would work, but he's just going to get louder and louder possibly. So, okay, so I would say that imposing measures intended to prevent births cannot be, like, just by virtue of we'd have no way of doing that.
Yeah, I don't know if it couldn't be, but right now that's not really the case.
Okay, so we're good on that. And then E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
Yeah, I could point to a few examples for that as well.
Okay, so we're gonna go with B, C, and E, and then let's see here. I'm gonna put up something on the screen. So we've got Jimmy Midget who is watching, and he also said B, C, and E for sure. D is hard to point out, but someday genetic testing might make it possible. So, so that's his perspective on the matter. And so maybe if I zoom in, I can read stuff on my own screen here.
I guess we can just start going through it.
Yeah, let's go through it. So the first thing is I actually kind of want to touch on A because I think it's very interesting that, well, actually, let me back up. So I'm going to tell you right now where we're going to have a pain point on any of these. And that's with the highlighted section that I got here where it says with the intent to destroy in whole or in part.
Yeah.
And it's a group. Okay. And so I think that's going to be a very difficult bar to meet. Okay. And I think it's actually a very critical element of the definition of a genocide because it's what makes it stand out from just people getting killed. Okay. Because if I go on a rampage and I just start killing people in a grocery store, that's not necessarily a genocide. That's a horrible action, and there are other words for it. Some, unsavory ones as well, but it's not a genocide, right? And there's a reason that it's not a genocide. So let's talk about everything with this concept of intent to destroy. Okay, as we're going through. Now, is that going to be a sticking point for you at this moment? Like, do you want to quibble with the very beginning?
I think that I could demonstrate intent based on
Okay.
words that have been said by politicians, by people writing these bills,
Okay.
to destroy in whole or in part, right? So it doesn't have to be a whole; it can be in part,
Okay.
So.
All right. So I'm very curious about this killing the members of the group because we do know, as we established a moment ago, that some members have been killed for being trans. And earlier, when we were looking at the 10 stages of genocide, where we were kind of arguing over certain things like, the propaganda and the polarization and whether or not, there are laws that protect you to be a Nazi and whether or not, and we were kind of touching on the idea that if you say certain things about people, that can lead to harm.
It can, yeah.
Right? Like that was your position earlier. So when you say, hey, we can, certain things that can be said can lead to harm to an individual, and then harm can be all the way up to death. Then we look and we say, well, part of the definition of genocide is that there's killing members of the group. Why wouldn't you agree to that? And I'm not arguing in favor of it because I
Right,
don't
yeah.
think any of them apply. But
This is kind of we were kind of arguing against our own points at this point, right? So I guess I would say like A isn't the case because um, the state apparatus that you would see in a genocide isn't to that point where they're actively rounding up, members of the group and then killing them, whether it be through a firing squad or concentration camps or things like that. So that's why I wouldn't make that distinction. While there may be there are people who are killed for being trans, like
Mhm,
like we mentioned, like 36 last year, 6 so far this year. Um, and the rhetoric behind a lot of this could be a cause of that. Saying they're groomers and pedophiles and they should be eradicated, things like that.
mhm.
I don't think there's a state apparatus that is behind like killing certain members just for being trans, right? That's not like I think even if for example, you could say like um, it doesn't have to be a state apparatus. That's so hard to like
That
nail
was
down. A,
right.
A is
That's
A
my
is
next
very
question.
specific.
Okay. So you don't agree that a state apparatus is necessary for a genocide? Like it can be a non-state apparatus.
Um,
It can be a group.
well, I mean, as long as it fits the definitions
Okay.
of the genocide, then I
Okay.
guess it doesn't need to be a state apparatus now.
Okay. Because I would agree that it doesn't have to be the state that commits genocide.
But
That you
the
can have
state does most of the genocides.
They,
The
they
state.
do. They do. I agree that. But I do believe that there are groups out there in history where we've seen that they were large enough and they committed genocide, and it wasn't necessarily the state or the formal government of that, or
For sure.
maybe it was like a rebel government or something like that. So it wasn't, so you've got some sort of ambiguity on who it actually was. But I do believe that it does not necessarily require a state um, necessarily for a genocide. Okay, so we're okay with A. So you and I are in agreement that A is not happening. So let's look at B. And
Not yet, at
and
least.
I'm sorry.
Not yet, at least.
Okay, well, not yet is not right.
Yeah.
So B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group.
Yes,
Okay,
I would
so
say
how?
so. Well, there are several bills that ban gender affirming care for trans youth, and that will force a trans youth to undergo a puberty that they don't want to go through.
Mhm,
Um, they don't identify with this, and it could cause severe dysphoria, whether that be manifested through mental illness or some sort of like physical dramatic change that they just don't really want to see. Um, and regardless of whether they intend to cause them to commit suicide, it does whenever there's studies behind the idea that gender affirming care reduces the risk of depression and suicidality. Um, so when you see in states that allow gender affirming care to take place, whether that be from the consent of their parents or whether that be from the advice of medical professionals or both or assent from the actual person, or all three, um, then there's severely reduced risk of their suicide. So I would argue that not allowing a trans youth to undergo gender affirming care, this definitely does cause severe mental harm for them.
okay. Um, so let me ask you: should a youth be able to do whatever they want with their body?
No, of course not. Not whatever they want.
Okay, why not?
Well, because for example, for they are a youth, right? So they can't do whatever they want. But when we're talking about gender affirming care, this is done with years of tracking um, this youth, um, and it's done with both assent from the minor, consent from the parents, and medical professionals actively observing the minor, making sure they're actually going through gender dysphoria. So it's not like, you know, I want to be a dinosaur, make me a dinosaur. And then the doctor's like, okay, and then boom. It's not like that. They're not like it's not whatever the minor wants to do. Um, it's it's going through the steps and because this is a big decision, right? Like going through puberty blockers
Mhm.
is reversible. However, like going through HRT is not. So doing that is a step you're taking, and that's typically done at like 16 or whatever. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay, but puberty has already started by 16, right?
Well, puberty blockers are started before that.
Okay, so then it actually has to start earlier.
Well, the puberty blockers does, yeah. Like,
Right.
and that's not to say like
Because that's
there are some people that go on puberty blockers that decide I'm not trans anymore, and they can go through puberty just fine without the blockers. Like once you stop taking it, you go through puberty just fine.
is that always the case?
Um,
Because
what do you mean?
my understanding is that if you're on puberty blockers long enough, that we actually are not quite clear what the long-term effects are going to be, and that there are some issues with people that have been on them so long that they have trouble with fertility, and that there are additional mental health concerns.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything linking fertility to puberty blockers, but I have seen it with HRT.
So because here's the thing. Um, when it comes to youth, and you and I are going to disagree on this probably tremendously, and we're not going to get past it. I could just tell you right now. I don't believe that a youth necessarily can consent. Okay. And I was doing a little bit of research, and I saw this interesting thing.
Well, there is something called medical consent
Right.
and assent, right? Those are different things.
So, and I went to look back because I wanted to see kind of like what did we historically do. Okay. Because again, remember, when I'm so everything is when I look at this argument of is there a trans genocide, what I'm looking at is like I want to know, are things different for the trans community in a way that will lead to what I understand a genocide to be? If they're not different, then then I say it's not a genocide. Or if it doesn't fit the definition of a genocide, then I say, well, it's not a genocide, right? So so I was looking back and I found this a very interesting document. And I wish I didn't have time to look up for something a little bit more maybe current, but this comes from the DePaul University, The Rights of Minors to Medical Treatment. It's from 1979, so it's quite old and probably some things have changed. However, I think this will be interesting to read. Just a really quick, like few sentences. It says, um, when the patient is a minor, the general rule has been that the express or implied consent of the parent or guardian is necessary to authorize medical treatment. The rationale of this consent requirement is that minors lack the sophistication and intelligence to evaluate the consequences of medical treatment, and therefore they cannot give an informed, involuntary consent to the procedure. Right. So the reason I bring this up is because this has been the standard for a long time. So to apply it
Right.
now, I need to know, why would it now no longer be a valid reason for not allowing a youth to consent. So we're just talking about the youth right
I
now.
don't. Well, I mean, you even said that before they're 18, as long as the parent consents, that has been standard practice to allow it to happen. No.
Correct. Correct.
So
The parent
so
has.
we're not talking about preventing it from happening below 18 with we're not talking about laws banning gender affirming care for anyone below 18 as long as the parent doesn't consent. We're talking about laws in the books banning it from anyone under 18 regardless of the consent of the parent.
So that brings up an interesting point, because part of the problem that people are having is that we're not just simply talking about a very small handful of teens who have been seeing a doctor for many years or for a very long time, what have you. It doesn't have to be years necessarily, but we're not talking about just this simple, hey, this particular kid, this one out of 100,000 is being seen, and the doctor and several doctors have agreed and they believe that this is the right thing for the child. We're seeing an explosion where you've got a lot of adults who seem to be playing along very, very quickly. And we're also seeing a lot of detransitioners come out. I don't say a lot, that's a very vague word, but we're seeing some detransitioners come out, and they're saying their stories are, no, I was rushed. Like I went in and an hour later they were signing me up, right, for medical for
Yeah.
pharmaceuticals, right? So a lot of these laws, and don't get me wrong, I don't always agree with them. A lot of these laws are in response to what appears to be adults not being adults. So we have youth who back in the day, at least, it was standard that they could not consent, right? Because they didn't have the ability to say, you know what, I will be okay if I grow up and I'm 30 and realize that this wasn't for me and I actually want to have children. And the long term use of these pharmaceuticals or these procedures um, are going to render me unable, unable to reverse them, right? So this has been the problem that we're having, and so how do you address that?
So you point to a few examples of detransitioners who say they were rushed through it, and I would say that that's not really the standard. For every single organization that I've looked at, whether it be um, Help Planned Parenthood, whether it be the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, they all recommend, whether it be a year or a few years of observing the youth to see if they're actually undergoing. Um, I think they say, you know, undergoing gender dysphoria, gender or a desire to identify with a gender that differs from the one they were assigned at birth. Right.
Mhm,
So it's not there. There may be a few examples of doctors who were negligent and
mhm.
they rushed someone through it, and then they go years down the line, and they say they regret it. Um, that's not the norm, and there are for every trans regretter or someone who goes through a detransition um detransition as a result of regret, um there are way more people who wish they could have transitioned earlier, and they couldn't do it because of either their parents didn't support them in their transition, or the law said they couldn't do it, right? And you can bring up detransitioners, but most people who detransition don't do it because they, you know, realized they weren't trans. They do so because they weren't, they didn't have the financial capability. They, social pressure, their family didn't support them anymore, stuff like that. So yeah.
Well, I'm not going to sit here and judge why they transitioned or detransitioned. I'm just going to say, like, look, we have people that have come back and said, "Hey, I once was taking these pharmaceuticals," or I think there's been a few cases where they've actually had surgical procedures, and they're like, "I no longer, this is not, I realize this is not who I am. I can't go back." And
Okay.
unfortunately, the process was such that it was rushed. Now, here's the thing that I'm having a problem with. We say, well, it's just a handful of people. The trans community isn't that big.
Hmm.
So when you talk about a handful of people, even 3 or 4 or 5, that's a lot for a small community. I mean, the community already is small to begin with. And so proportionally, I would expect to see like maybe 0 or if you can't see, but maybe 1, but probably 0. Like, but I don't remember the names at the moment, but I've seen at least 3 or 4 different people who have come out and told their story and said, I was rushed. And so I'm like, well, wait a minute. And then we start seeing that parents are responding to in different parts of the country, people that seem to be rushing this process with them, with their kids, even if it's just socially, right? So I think, so I'm not sure that I agree that this is necessarily causing serious bodily or mental harm, because I can't get past the very beginning part where there may be people that are rushing the treatments in the first place. And so I'm like, well, if you're preventing people from rushing treatments that maybe aren't necessary, then you're not really causing bodily harm.
Well,
You might actually be preventing it, at least in some cases, right?
right. I would say that, a majority of trans people don't detransition, right? You're talking about like maybe 1% of the trans population that detransitions,
I,
whereas like
I don't have a specific number
right,
on.
there's no real numbers on that issue, but it's still it's a very small number. So even if there are a few people who say like, that they wanted to detransition and they were rushed through their transition, that doesn't change the fact that denying the 99% or however number, maybe 90%, we can be, reasonable,
Okay.
or generous, like 90% of the trans people that have gone through, the transitions.
Okay.
I would say like denying that 90% or 99% of trans people life-saving care that is causing bodily and mental harm to that
Okay.
community.
Okay, but that's not the full definition here of genocide, right? And so this is my point. So if some of these laws are there to prevent people who are rushing it, even if they're overkill, right? And then that's not a good word, but even if they're overdoing it, right? Like, hey, maybe there are some people that are getting caught in the mix, and they actually do need these treatments, okay? And many of the people are responding to and saying, hey, look, it looks like you're rushing it, and while 96 people out of every 100 that want it, there's 4 that don't. Okay.
Okay.
So we need to protect those 4 that don't, because you're rushing it and we don't know that 4 won't lead to 5 or 6 or 7, right? Doesn't that kind of mean that there's not really an intent to
Okay.
destroy in whole or part? Like there's no intent to
So
harm somebody there. You're
so
actually,
you're
even if you're wrong, that's not your intent.
so you're agreeing that denying trans youth gender affirming care does cause mental harm, but you're just having an issue with the intent.
Correct, because
Okay.
again, the whole conversation here is there a genocide happening? I'm
Right.
not suggesting that there aren't bad things that happen. Anytime you restrict any kind of medical procedure of any kind, somebody is going to be mentally harmed in some way, right?
Right.
That's
Okay.
just, like there's like almost 8 billion people on the planet. If there is a medical procedure, that's probably meant for somebody, right? And so
It,
if you start restricting them, then somebody's going to, potentially be out. But the question here is the reason that people are putting these laws into place, is their intent to destroy people, or is the intent something else? Because if it's something else, then it
right.
doesn't fit
I
this definition of genocide.
I'd say it'd be different if like the people writing these laws had the same attitude as you do, because you seem to be, pretty pro-trans or whatever. And you just have an issue with certain you just have an issue because certain people have come back and said you know, they they detransitioned later on and they were rushed through it. So you just have an issue with it being applied too soon, or
I,
some
I don't
medical
think
malpractice being involved.
I don't think
I
that most
wish.
conservatives have an intent, because it's really led by the conservatives. Let's be honest.
Right.
Okay,
I
I
would
don't think they
agree.
have an intent to destroy people.
I would agree with you if the conservative politicians had the attitude that you do about this, but they don't, right? They clearly have this view of gender that is, conservative, right? They have this traditional idea of you're male, you're female, you're man, you're woman, and that's just kind of it. There's no moving around.
Mhm.
Um, that's kind of where I would show the intent is these people, um, clearly by the words they say, have an intent to you know, at least when they're below 18, deny them gender affirming care because they don't think it's real, right? They think that they should, stop pretending, right? So
Sure, and so I'm going to sympathize a little bit with the conservatives, right? Like I believe that conservatives tend to be very reactionary, and I kind of foresaw some of this stuff a long time ago. I was like, hey, I think that activists out there are ruining everything. The activists in any crowd, they ruin stuff because they go berserk and they go crazy in their own crowd. They don't reel them in. So then what happens is the activist in Group A, they cause people in group B to be more willing to accept their activists that are doing things. And then you just kind of had this back and forth. And it's almost like this big clash of which activist is going to get their way the most. And then you've got the others who may not necessarily be activists, but they're sympathetic because there is something real. There's a real concern there. And so when I look at this, I kind of sympathize with the conservatives. And I think, based on my observation, that most of them, and probably most politicians too, aren't out there to destroy in any way the trans community. Now, that doesn't mean that what they're doing is always the best or even correct. I've actually disagreed with some of the bills out there related to like trans and LGBT youth and whatnot. So I've disagreed with some of them, even though the underlying principle, I did say, I think there is a concern to be had here. I just don't think this is the right approach. Okay. But I also don't believe that the people that are pushing them are necessarily out to, their intent is not to destroy. And
I guess that's
that's
kind of
why
the
I
crux
said
of
I
our
don't think it's a
disagreement is
genocide.
that's kind of the crux of our disagreement is I would say there is intent to destroy in whole or in part, because if you say that trans people they can do whatever they want when they're adults, but beforehand, hands off. No puberty blockers, no HRT, none of that. Right? You are destroying in part the trans community. That is what's happening, and it also is intentional, right? Because like we talked about in the state of genocide, you have people spreading rhetoric against the trans community. These people that are writing bills are doing so. Well, like for example, the Texas Republican platform, right? And they're writing these bills also. They in their platform they said, we believe in men and women, and none of that trans stuff, right? So you can look at a pattern of things they're saying against the trans community. You can look at the people writing these bills that are saying these things, and then they're writing bills that lead to the destruction in part of the group. That shows intent. That shows destruction in part. That's what I would.
So I guess, yeah, I guess we're gonna have to, yeah, I guess we're gonna have to disagree on the destroying part, because I don't think that's the intent, right? Um, they may be intending to say, like I know there are some out there that say, like, I would like to eradicate, most of those are blowhards. So and I don't think that they have nearly as much momentum as it may sound like. I think the momentum is really driven by people who don't have an intent. So when you extract the people that have no intent, I think that what you have left are very few people, and they're not necessarily getting. I mean, they're kind of getting their way, because any win for some of them is a win. Okay.
So you think this concerted effort to write these bills is done so to accommodate the fraction of trans people who detransition, who say they were rushed through it? You
I
think
think
that
they're largely
these
trying to
people.
protect children, even if they're doing it wrong. I think that's largely their intent, right? Now, again, intent and what you do. Like, I can intend to do a lot. I can intend to, tell my wife that she's being a pain and then say it all wrong, right? Like what your intent is and what your action is are not necessarily aligned. So I think that their intent is to protect children. Now, I don't always agree with the way that they're going about it.
I think you give them too much credit, personally. I think
Okay.
that they might say they're doing it to protect children, but at the end of the day, even when they're adults, they don't believe. They don't believe them, right? They're not like, oh, well, you're actually trans, you're actually this, you're actually that. These people writing these bills, these Republicans, conservatives, not even just the politicians, they don't actually. Oh, we're just protecting the kids. They want them to go through a puberty that these trans youth don't want to go through. They want them to have to, later down the line, accommodate
Mhm.
for lack of availability for these you know um,
Right.
this gender affirming care.
And their argument, and which is kind of my argument as well, is not you, young people have a lack of ability to consent to certain things, right? You can consent if I want to give you a hug, right? Something was really, really simple, right? Like if I say, "Hey man, can I give you a hug?" You can consent to that all day, every day. You could consent to that if you're like 9, right? Like pretty much nobody's going to question that. But then you start getting into things that have ramifications. And then so then the ramifications, it's a matter of, and we're going back to that document that I pointed out, you know, um, you know, do you have the sophistication and intelligence to evaluate the consequences of medical treatment, um, and give proper, informed, and voluntary consent to a procedure? And the problem that a lot of people are bringing up, they're saying some of these pharmaceuticals, we're not really sure what the long-term effect is. And I think it's largely with the HRT, but I believe if you're on puberty blockers as well long enough, that's also a question there as well. Now, on the short-term basis, no, it's not a question. They are relatively safe. Um, so you see what I'm getting at here is that I think what's going on is that there actually is an intent to protect kids, even if they're doing it wrong. And then I would bolster that by saying the majority of the laws that we talk about, where they're really preventing somebody from doing something, they're pretty much preventing youth, minors, children. That's what they're aimed at.
Well,
There might be 1 or 2 laws that I think I've heard about, but there's gonna
in
be very,
Mississippi,
very
for
few
example.
laws. There's gonna be very, very, very few laws that apply to adults as well. And in many of those cases, some of those laws simply make it harder. Okay. So it's not impossible. And again, I'm not accepting that necessarily, but that's very common with laws. drug laws, all kind of laws. They make, gun laws right now, they're raising the age, so it's not uncommon to say, okay, well, an adult has to surpass this additional barrier. So if it's common in one area, then you can't say, well, because it's happening over here, it's because there's a genocide. You have to say, well, no, you kind of got to balance out what's kind of common to happen, right? You following what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, you said it. You said a bit there. I think we've
Right.
already litigated this idea of like medical consent. So
Okay.
at a certain age, like um, whenever a trans youth, they've been trans for a while, and the doctor sees they're trans, that's when they are able to go on puberty blockers.
Mhm.
And at around age 16 is when these experts on like medical professionals recommend um, that a trans youth who has gone through puberty blockers, they've shown dysphoria, they've shown all these things. That's when they can go through that thing. So it's not like children can't consent to medical care. I mean, they
Mhm.
they clearly can. I mean, in other cases, um, you can you can demonstrate that children can consent to medical care, whether it be for like procedures they need, like a broken leg. You can consent to getting your leg treated, right?
Mhm.
I would also argue that in a lot of these laws, they're not banning the actual medicine. What they're doing is they're banning it for the use of
Mhm.
gender affirming care, right?
Right.
So puberty blockers can be used for like girls who go through puberty at a very young age.
Precocious
What
puberty.
Right. What they're banning is using those puberty blockers for the purpose of blocking puberty. That way, you can figure out, are you trans? Just decide whether or not you actually want to go through gender affirming care,
Mhm.
like HRT, things like that. Maybe even when you're an adult, go through
Mhm.
surgeries and things like that. Um, so with regards to intent, if they actually wanted to protect children, they would ban it, entirely. But they're not doing that. They're just banning it for trans people. They're trying to destroy in whole or in part trans
Well,
kids.
trans minors.
Well, yeah, they're people.
Right. But specifically minors, right? Because that's like when you look at some of these bills, they explicitly say
But
like
but the
this bill
non-trans
is related.
minors getting puberty blockers for early onset puberty aren't not people either. I
Right.
mean,
But
I'm
when you
just
say
saying
trans people,
people.
you include everybody. I realize that
Well,
we're
they're targeting the trans people, not the non-trans people. They're not.
right,
The non-trans minors are getting the procedure, and it's just fine. It's just legal. The trans people, the trans minors, are getting it. It's now illegal in some
right,
states.
right. And
That's
so
that's
I
why I
don't.
was I was saying that.
And so when you I don't like to use the word target, but when you're focusing on trans
Why
minors,
not?
when you're well, I don't want to say target because I'm going to use it in a different context here in just a moment.
Well, the state is violence. They're
I,
targeting
I
trans
I
people.
understand that, but I want to use it differently in just literally in just a moment. So when you're focusing on minors, trans minors with your bills, you are
Mhm,
not targeting trans people. That's why I wanted to use it. You're not targeting trans people because you're literally focusing on a subset
mhm,
of the trans community, right? Because once you become 18, in most states, you can pursue the care that you want. In most cases. Now, there are some cases where they've added some hurdles. I would disagree with that. Once you're 18, once we've decided that, hey, the legal age is 18, 18 is 18, you can consent, even if I don't like the idea, right? So I would definitely object to any medical treatment being withheld. Yeah, I'm going to say I'll go with any medical treatment. Please, we'll skip any of the really crazy stuff that might be out there. Um, so to me, I think we have to be careful with our words. We can't just say, "Oh, you're targeting the trans people," when it's really focusing on trans youth. And then we
okay.
have to go back and say, "Well, why are you focusing on them? Do you just want them all to die? Is that your intent?" I don't think the intent is to destroy them. I think the intent is to help them, even if their actions may be wrong. And that's why I think, and again, we're kind of going back in circles,
Mhm,
and we're going to want to be careful because the next point is basically going to be the same argument all over again, right? Like deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. I don't think that's happening. In fact, I think the point I just made, where most of the bills are focusing on the issues of trans minors or minors, because I'm not, we'll just go with minors right now, but it's focusing on minors I don't, but they don't have an issue with adults, then you're not necessarily. I don't believe that you can say it's a calculated to bring about this physical destruction, because we know that there are therapies for adults. Many of them are on it. We've even got celebrities that are on some of these, that have acquired some of um, uh, these medical, drawing a blank on the word I want, procedures, on these medical procedures.
Right. So I guess two things for that, and then if you want to move on to the
Sure.
next point, that's fine. Just two last things on on B. Um, when you say it's not targeting trans people, just the kids, right? Well, whenever even if okay, first of all, in part, trans people includes adults and minors. In part, targeting minors, that would be intent. They don't want kids to be trans. So that would be destroying in part, in my opinion, at least. And then even into adulthood, denying um, trans people access to puberty blockers and HRT when they're 16, things like that. Um, that has ramifications when they're adults. They've gone through puberty, right? They have physical attributes that can cause dysphoria. So
Mhm.
denying them the care when they're a teenager, when they're an adolescent, is causing problems when they're an adult that could lead to depression and suicide when they're going through gender dysphoria, things like that.
Right. And I'll give you that, actually, because from my perspective, so I'm, obviously I'm not a conservative, so I don't necessarily hold their same positions on things. So earlier I explained, in my position, in my view, that you've got activists that are going crazy, and they're causing the conservative crowd to be very reactionary and accept a lot of these, a lot of these bills, which I don't always agree with, but sometimes I do. I almost always agree with the underlying issue, which is I think that people are moving way too fast with youth. If we were talking about like one in every like couple 100,000, and like you barely knew or barely saw any stories of a trans kid, that was receiving, some sort of medical care, I would probably just chalk it up and say, you know what, they're probably receiving the care that they should have. But because we're seeing a lot of these stories, it looks to me, and because we're seeing what I think of are a disproportionate number of detransitioners for the size of the crowd that there is in the first place, this suggests to me that there is a problem, and that adults are playing a role in it, and that adults need to be curtailed. The problem is there's not any good way to curtail them. So what's going to happen is, when you curtail them to hopefully prevent unnecessary medical treatment, you may actually be preventing more necessary medical treatment. That is, and we established that earlier. This is, of course, goes back to the whole point of intent. If that's the whole reason that things are happening, then there's no intent to destroy anybody.
I don't really buy that. I think that the medical negligence in gender affirming care, as it is for other areas of medical care, is incredibly narrow. And if I'm not saying you, we're talking about the intent of the people writing the bills,
Mhm.
right? Um, if they see that little you know the the marginal number of people who have gone through and their doctors rushed them through, I would say that's medical negligence.
Mhm.
Um,
And you don't think
then
it's happening?
and well, I think it is happening, but it's very, as it is in other medical areas, it is incredibly marginal. And if you want to look at the small percentage of cases where medical negligence has happened and say you want to ban it entirely, I don't buy that your intent is to protect this 1%. You're targeting the whole group there. That shows a willingness to whether it be overreact or other sort of nefarious means.
So have you seen people overreact, in establishing legislation for anything else unrelated to trans stuff?
Related to genocide? Probably not.
No, just in general. Just in general.
I
When
mean,
you're out
maybe.
there and you're watching the news, and they're like, "Oh, there's this new bill," and you're like, "That's you've
Yeah,
never been able."
like banning TikTok. That's pretty overreactionary, I think.
Right. So because when I look at when I look at the landscape, I think quite a few bills are overreacting. Right. And so I don't know that overreacting is a sign of of intent. Again, so
Well, I mean, in the case of TikTok, you see people hate China. There's this rhetoric behind hating China, so of course they're going to
People always hate
overreact.
China.
Of course they're going to overreact to TikTok, right? The same thing for this. There's rhetoric around hating trans people. You know, it's popular to hate trans people. You know, there's this sort of so
Come on,
this whole
popular.
movement, this whole movement behind taking down whether it be pride displays like you know Target or whatever. Which I mean, fuck Target, right? But the same thing, right? Like this sort of willingness to overreact is a sign of intent. Like these people don't like trans people, so of course whenever they find an excuse, they find some sort of like what's the word I'm looking for, just excuse, right, to do it. They're gonna jump at it, right?
We don't need to get into it, but I'll just say that
I
I
think conservatives
disagree.
are evil and hate trans people.
Okay, so well, we're gonna have to disagree there. I think that the conservatives are a lot of things, but I don't think that they. I mean, I'm sure there are some, but I think overwhelmingly most of them don't really hate trans people. I think that they are really out there
Maybe the voters, but
to.
politicians do.
Well, I never trust any politicians, so I always I don't like any politicians almost ever, so that's kind of a given. Um, but I think the voters, I think the people that you run across in the store every single day when you're going to Walmart or wherever, right? I think those people, which are basically your neighbors, people you work with, I think those people do not hate trans people, and I don't think that it's actually popular to hate on trans people. I could tell you right now, I work for corporate America, and I'll tell you right now, if I were to go in there and try to even come close to hating on trans people, I would be probably fired. Okay. If not fired, I would be very close to it. Okay. So, and this is
I
the
was just
case
sort
in
of
a
I
lot of
was just
large
sort of
companies.
alluding in that example of like, the sort of the intent behind like, getting rid of these pride displays. I mean, like as far as like market forces, we're seeing less and less. As much as I hate, like this sort of like wishy-washy, like corporate, rainbow capitalism, stuff like that. As much as I dislike that, I think that
Mhm.
it is a sign of like a trajectory. So when we're seeing more corporations show support for pride, that shows a trajectory towards support for the LGBT community. What we're seeing now is sort of like a detraction from that. We're seeing people, like Target, for example, and Starbucks take down their pride displays as a reaction to a growing number of people who see this thing as grooming and pedophilia.
So is
That's
it
sort of the point that I was
possible?
making there with the
Fair.
it's popular, right?
That's okay. Is it possible? Let's just say your side and my side, just to make it really easy. It's not really a good split, but we don't have time to try to make a good
I
split. So let's
gotcha.
just make it.
Yeah,
So your side, my side. Your side is very much more in the pro trans side. I'm a little bit less so, at least in terms of laws and youth and so on and so forth. And um, is it possible? Would you agree that people on your side have lost their damn minds? Some of them.
um, no, not
You
really.
don't think so?
I don't really think so. No, I think you could point to a few examples of some crazy leftists out there. I'm sure there are. Like for example, like MLs and stuff like that. They're pretty crazy. But
So what? Say what again?
MLs like Marxist Leninists. They're pretty crazy stuff.
I
Like
don't know who that
the
is.
people that support Stalin and stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
They're pretty far gone and crazy. I don't really they're whatever. Um, I I don't think you can make a statement that a sizable number of pro trans people have lost their mind. No.
Oh, okay. So everybody, the allies, the LGBTQ, everybody on that side is being completely rational, and everybody that's opposing them is being, well, I say, but there's a large number of people that are opposing them who are being completely irrational.
There are some
That's
people
the
who may
position.
say things that are irrational. They may react
Because I follow a
to
lot of people who are in the trans and LGBTQ space, like they identify
right.
as
Well,
such,
well,
and
how
they're
would
like,
you define losing your mind then? I guess.
and they will say like we get active hate from our own group because we disagree with certain things, right? And they get called all kind of nasty names from that same crowd, which is weird because I was told by many people that if you call trans people very nasty things, it could lead to harm. But
Could.
apparently, it's acceptable for trans people who are not towing the line. And this is what I'm getting at. I'm not just trying to go, well, what about you guys? That's not what I'm trying to go. What I'm trying to get at is saying, I think that what's going on a lot of these bills are being driven by people that are responding to people who are acting like fools, activists on your side, if you will, who are not being reined in and told, knock it the hell off. You're making things worse. You are the reason why that group of people over there is accepting all these crazy laws. And we might actually gain more ground if you weren't acting like such a damn fool. For instance, the trans person that went to the White House and started going topless and getting all crazy and then was excused by the White House.
No,
These kind
the
of
White House
things,
kicked her out. She's not allowed to go
right,
there anymore.
right. But these kind of antics, I think, are giving ammunition to people to people who say maybe we do need to protect kids. Maybe we need to do this because, by golly, they keep saying they're not coming for our kids, but then you have all these weirdos that are saying exactly that, and nobody's checking them. Nobody's saying, knock it off. That's not how most of us believe. I follow several people that are like LGB, and they're like, we're done with this. Like, we just
Well,
want to
yeah,
party,
because
be left alone. And they're like, this is insane. This is insane. So I think what's really happening, and this is again going back to the intent, that people on the right are responding to a lot of people on the left. And I think it goes back and forth. So I'm not necessarily saying
well,
I started it. I'm
well,
just saying it goes back and
let's
forth.
sort of like narrow down to to pro trans, anti trans, right? So you say LGB, those people are obviously against
They
trans
get mixed
people.
in it though. They get mixed in the group. Like,
Well, yeah, because the same people that don't like trans people don't like gay people either. I mean, people that's sort of why the acronym exists, is because the
right.
struggle for the rights of queer people exists all throughout. It's not like the person attacking trans people is gonna be like, oh, okay, you're gay, it's fine. It's no, of course not. They don't like they don't like gay people either.
Right. But
That's why they get lumped in.
even people in the LGBT and trans community, I don't know if that's the right one, but even people within those groups who clearly identify as such, even they are getting tired of it. So
Okay,
I think
so
you may want to rethink whether or not there are people on your side, again, if you will, that need to be reined in and told, knock it off.
like, what are they doing, for example? Like, can you give an example of what they're doing that you'd say
So
that is that they're going too far, they're being crazy, they're
So I think what started one of the things that started it, and I hate to mention it, is the libs of TikTok. We all seen, and there are certainly problems with the libs of TikTok, right? Like the biggest problem,
many problems.
one of the biggest problems that my friend has pointed out. He said, if you scroll through and you just watch video after video after video, he said you've just seen 20 videos, but those
Mhm.
20 videos may be 20 different people across the whole United States. But the feeling is that the 20 people were like maybe around the corner when they're not really. You might like maybe none of those 20 are in your city. So, so it gives this disproportionate illusion of how many people there are out there, because you see a whole bunch of videos and that's what you've seen, right? Like that's what, that kind of shapes your mind. And so you're like, oh my God, everybody's like that. And it's not really everybody. However, nobody was checking, nobody was calling and saying, on the side of the trans people, the pro trans people, there weren't people that were saying early on that were saying those people are inappropriate. We need them to knock it off. Same thing with the drag shows, right? Everybody's having a big fit about the drag shows,
Mhm.
and
That points to our second, our C, right? Some
um,
of that direct stuff.
yeah, yes.
But keep going. I'm sorry. I mean,
So it's the same concept there, right? Like nobody really cared about drag up until about, like, I don't know, like a year ago or something like that. Nobody really cared about it. I mean, you didn't really see much about it. You didn't hear people weren't
mhm.
talking about it. Now, when people talk about it, they, like in my circles, the people that I watch that are really fervently against, things that are going on in this drag community, it's always pertaining to children every
Mhm.
single time, right? And there are some videos. I mean, I've seen some videos of like a dude with his G-string ass, like literally shaking it right up in front of like a 9-year-old kid's face. And I'm like, this is not appropriate, right? And the problem is we haven't seen a lot of the people on the pro-trans side that have said, you know what, that's not appropriate. That person needs to knock it off. They don't represent me. What happened instead was a lot of people would say, well, drag is okay, blah, blah. So it's like they sidestepped it and just ignored it rather than come out and say, you know what, Matt Walsh, you're right. That person was terrible, god awful, and they sure as hell don't represent me. And you know what? I'm going to go tell the manager of that restaurant or that, business myself that was not appropriate. That didn't happen. So what happened was they sidestepped it. Then you got the Matt Walshes that went and just kept hammering and drew a big crowd. You have a big crowd now. You have all these conservatives that are all riled up. They've watched 1,400 videos on TikTok. So they think that every school teacher is out to teach their kid trans stuff. Then they see the occasional school that says, hey, you know what? Maybe we're going to put a bill in, or we're going to pass some sort of rule that says that teachers should not tell parents stuff, which is totally contrary to how everybody's been living up until this point. So then what happens is somebody says, well, maybe we should make a bill that stops this from happening, stops this from happening. And so all these people that are frustrated rush to it to accept it. And so I think that long ago it could have been stopped and we didn't have to get to this point. But
Yeah,
you have to acknowledge that people on your side are acting like damn fools, and we're not.
I would say this focus on trans people isn't a result of trans people acting fools. It's a result of the words of conservatives, right? That they're intentionally focusing on it. You know, I'm sure you could point me an example of like something happening at a pride event that I would find, you know, probably inappropriate. And that's honestly all that stuff is on the parents of those kids, right? Like if there is a drag show or a pride parade that has been advertised as, you know, adult only, because I went to a pride event in Biloxi and they advertised, you know, saying there's going to be a drag show. You know, this could contain material that, you know, you might not want your kid looking at, right?
Mhm.
Which I think most responsible pride event hosts would do. But regardless of whether or not, you know, that's regardless of you know, a few instances, it's not going to change their rhetoric. They've been saying the same thing. They've been saying they're targeting kids, you know, regardless of all that stuff. I mean,
Okay.
like we were talking about earlier with the bubbles and stuff. Like
Mhm.
the Nazis were calling trans people the corruptors of youth. You know, even before pride events were even really a thing. I don't think there were pride events in Germany before that happened. Um, so, I mean, yeah, I'm sure you could point me to an example or two or three or maybe even, you know, a few um, of an instance where I would say it's inappropriate, but I don't think it represents an entire community. And I think the willingness to react to that um, is an indication of the ideas and opinions and sort of view of the people that are reacting and not the people that are, you know, being crazy, essentially.
So let me throw a comment up here because I do want to address this comment. I can get my mouse over there.
Okay, and then we can move on to C if you'd like.
Absolutely. So this comment comes from Jimmy Midget, and it says none of this makes genocide okay. On that statement, face value, totally agree. It doesn't make genocide okay. However, we are in a disagreement whether or not there's a genocide happening. Okay. But I agree. It doesn't make genocide okay. And even if we were to say a lesser term, right, like violence, just we'll go very generic, no, it wouldn't make violence okay either. Okay. In most cases, like I think I mean, if I walk in and somebody's doing something to my child, then maybe that's a different story. But just in general, just this idea that maybe there's inappropriate displays of behavior. No, that wouldn't make violence okay. The idea that maybe some doctors are over prescribing stuff, right? That doesn't make violence okay because I mean, doctors have been over prescribing stuff forever, right? I mean,
Mhm.
before COVID, medical mistakes were like the third largest cause of death in the United States, right? So there was already an existing problem in the
Yeah,
medical
if we
community,
want to attack medical negligence, I'm all for
right?
doing that. Hell yeah.
So I just want to make it very, very clear. None of what I'm saying is to justify any kind of violence. I'm very, very much anti-violence in as much as I can. I mean, I barely will go to a protest because I just don't want to be around violence if it happens to pop off. So, I want to make it
Fair
very,
enough.
very clear because I know that I'm making some strong arguments here, against certain things, but I want to make sure that's very clear, not accepting violence. So let's move on to C, or which we kind of were
Right.
talking about. And I think that C and B, in a sense, are going to share very much the same
Mhm.
arguments that we've been talking about, right? Like, does it affect? In my opinion, this is largely going to be affected for youth, and I believe that youth cannot consent, and I believe that adults who are supposed to be consenting on their behalf are doing a piss poor job of it. And then I think that you have all these other forces that are happening, which are probably minuscule in the grand scheme of things, but I don't think that they're being properly addressed by the very crowd for which they exist in. So they're getting addressed by a different crowd.
Okay.
And I think that the majority of people actually have an intent that is not to destroy. There's no intent to say, you know what, we're gonna stop you, 15-year-old, from getting this pharmaceutical because I know that it's going to lead to your death. I don't believe people are doing that. That would be C, right? I don't think that's happening, and I think you would be very hard pressed to prove that and this is the reason why I think that genocide doesn't really exist, because you have to prove the intent, and I think you have way too many things that are going on that contradict the idea of consent. Go. I don't want to.
Okay, I can make the connection for C. There's a specific bill in Tennessee, which thankfully has been blocked by the courts for now, but it has passed the Tennessee legislature and signed by the governor. So, say a conservative judge decides to not block this anymore, it will be law in Tennessee. It's the known as the trans bill, right? There are issues with this bill that or not trans, the drag bill. I think I might have said trans. My
Okay.
mistake. It's the drag bill. Um, there are issues with this bill that could lead to the destruction in whole or in part of trans people, right? The bill mentions banning male or female impersonators in public spaces or where children could be. Um, and the bill does not define that. So easily one can interpret that to be, and in Tennessee, they don't allow changing in birth certificates. So someone, was born male and they are a trans woman, the legal system in Tennessee wouldn't really recognize that. So they could be seen by the law enforcement or whoever else as a female impersonator, right? And this law is very, intentionally very vague. It's only like 2 pages.
Mhm.
They never define male or female impersonators. They also say, hang on, let's look at the
So you
actual.
believe, so I would agree with you. So on what I'm hearing, I haven't read the bill, but on what I'm hearing, I would oppose this bill. Okay,
Right.
because
So so
I don't like vague bills. I like bills that if there's a problem that needs to be solved, then they solve it very as surgically as possible, right? Because otherwise, you open up all kind of problems. So on the face value, I would agree that this is a bad bill.
they also mentioned this idea of like performances, like they don't really define performances. Um, so we're talking about a trans person who lives in Tennessee. Say this law were to not be blocked anymore by the federal courts. Um, you're talking about the way to avoid prosecution for being a impersonator is to either leave Tennessee, never leave your house,
Mhm.
or detransition, which would be you know a destruction of the group in whole or in part, because trans people are going to have to detransition if they want to live in Tennessee, according to this bill.
Well, I'm going to have trouble like arguing with this because I haven't read the bill to know that I fully agree
I mean, it's
that
it's
it's
pretty
going to
short. You could
force
go
you.
through it.
I mean, well, we're coming up on 2 hours. We probably shouldn't try to pull any more documents in. So,
Fair enough.
'cause I don't know how long you planned on being on here. I don't want to be on here too terribly long. But on the surface, the issue of the drag part, I would definitely oppose. I would have to read the rest of it and get some more information. But more than likely, based on what other bills that I've seen, I don't believe that you would be able to convince me that there's an intent to destroy. Because again, we're talking about, can a youth consent to certain things? And I believe that they cannot. And this is going to be that sticking point. So the sticking point is going to be, for all of these, is going to be two things: intent, and whether or not a youth can can consent. And so, but then you look at it
Well,
and you
this
see,
has nothing to do with that. I mean, it's
and
male
then
or
you see
female
that,
impersonators.
right, and again, yeah, I've seen I was doing bill reviews, for fun. I don't know. I think nobody says that, but I was doing bill reviews on prior
Sounds like something I'd
episodes.
do.
Right. So I've done bill reviews in the past where I just read them and I'm like, that's a junk bill. That's a junk bill. And I think I went through like 27 bills, and like two of them I liked. One was to defund the Department of Education. And then the other one was to end qualified immunity, I believe. Right. Like those are the only two bills out of like 27 that I actually liked. The rest of them I didn't like. And the reason is because bills by nature, when I read them, they're just very open and vague. And when I am Joe Schmo. I am not a lawyer. So I like, if I can read it and I can foresee problems, maybe, and I don't know why, maybe that's how law is supposed to be written. I don't really know. But from my perspective as just a regular citizen, when I read something and I see that it doesn't even appear to attempt to be more surgical, that it's very open and vague and can be used in all sorts of ways, unintended ways that I can figure out, then I say it's probably not a good bill. And I think that this kind of falls within that same category. And so again, when I look at things, the first thing I say is compared to what? If you say, well, this bill has all these exaggerative things in there and it's going to cause this rippling effect, compared to what? Other bills that don't do that? No, other bills do that. Like, this seems to be the very nature of bills. So that alone is insufficient, because that's kind of how bills tend to be as far as I've read them. Right. And that's not excusing the bill. I mean, I think there's probably pretty solid ground to, argue against the bill. But the very fact that it can be overused or used in, negligent ways, or, unintended ways, I think that's a lot more common. And so I don't think that gives evidence to a genocide.
I mean, I would say it's intentionally vague to cause harm to trans people. As in a lot of these bills, it's
But any more
intentionally vague.
intentionally vague than other bills that are unrelated to trans issues?
I'm not too sure. I mean, this bill seems to be in particular especially vague. Um, but I'm sure you could find other vague bills, but I don't think it really has anything to do with genocide.
Well, no. What I'm trying to establish is, if it's common for bills to be vague, then that in itself is not a problem. That's not the issue.
We're looking at the intent
That's
of the authors
right.
and the
Then
intent
we
of the
have
people signing these bills.
Because again, we're trying to establish whether or not there's a genocide happening. And if we say, well, there's a genocide happening, well, how do you know that? Well, because these bills that are being written are vague. Okay, well, lots of bills are vague. Are there genocides happening in other spaces? Well, no. Okay, well, then maybe that's not a good criteria for what constitutes a genocide. So maybe we have to look at other criteria, and that's what I'm getting at. So you always want to say, compared to what? Compared to other bills? If other bills are really tight, and you rarely find a bill that's vague, well, then yeah, I think you would have an argument there. I think
I
you would
don't
have a case.
I don't really think you'd have to compare it to imply intent. I just think you have to look at other other things, but like the words of the author, like the sort of atmosphere around attacks on trans people to look at intent.
But
Y-
but
y-
then you're looking at things that are outside of the scope of even what we've established to look at, right?
I disagree. We've been talking about this whole atmosphere of anti-trans people, anti-trans legislation. It's a whole bunch of bills that have been proposed and passed. Um, I don't think you can dismiss away intent to harm by just saying this bill's vague. So what? I mean, the bill is intentionally vague to harm trans people. There's a reason why they don't define the term male or female impersonator. It's so
So
that it can be interpreted to apply to trans people,
right.
and they can either detransition or move out of the state. They
I,
they they, they want them gone or dead.
so I hear you on intentionally vague. What I'm trying to say is that other bills are intentionally vague, and so the question is why? If the answer is, well, people tend to write intentionally vague bills, then you cannot use that as a criteria to
That's not the
establish
reason.
genocide in this space, and then say, well, it's pretty normal in those other spaces. Like, it makes sense that all those other bills that affect other people are intentionally vague, and there's no genocide or no malfeasance there. That's just the normal thing that happens. But then turn around and say, but the trans folk, well,
Well,
the
not all
intentionally
not
vague
all
bills
bills are
here,
vague. I mean, I don't really know
a
if
lot of them are. A lot of them
there
are.
are a lot of bills that are vague, but I don't think it's the norm to have vague bills. There are vague bills out there. I would just say in this instance, it's intentionally vague to harm trans people.
Okay, and I don't think you've established intentionally vague, like any more
Well,
than
they
any other.
refuse to define male or female impersonators, for one. It's
Right,
not
and
it's not
and
defined in the entire bill.
and there are other bills where they have piss poor definitions as well, right? I've read some of them myself, and I said, I don't under. What do you mean
Well,
by this word?
usually in a bill, you'll see,
Hmm.
for the purpose of this bill,
Yep,
this word means this word means that, and that is the norm, right? That
correct.
is the norm. But
Correct.
what we don't see is that in this bill. We're seeing
Okay.
intentionally
I
left out a
can't speak to
definition
that.
for male or female
I,
impersonators.
I I can't speak to that one in specific, but I do know that other bills have left out what I think
Well,
are pertinent definitions. And I'm
for the
because
record,
I've asked.
we're talking about Tennessee SB 3. So anyone watching wants to read the bill for themselves, they can go for it.
Sure, absolutely. So let's move on because we're getting late here, and
Yeah.
I don't know that you wanted to spend all night arguing with somebody 2 times your age. Like, dude, you're like arguing with your grandpa over here for like 2 or 3 hours.
I
Like,
do
I
that a lot
mean,
too sometimes. So
okay, I mean,
I'm used to it.
maybe that's your standard. Maybe that's what you do. That's fine. Okay. Um, so let's move on. Imposing measures intended to prevent birth. I think we ruled
Mhm.
that out earlier.
Right. Yeah.
And then forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
Mhm.
Um, I would argue that this is where if you
This is
if this
clear.
if this article was revised to be updated to include trans, I would think that in addition to a national ethnical, racial, or religious group, that E would have to be severely modified because when you are talking about forcibly transferring children, my wife is Indonesian, for example. So the example I would argue is that if we were trying to genocide the Indonesians, we would literally take Indonesian kids and give them to somebody else, right? And there would be a very clear distinction of who is being taken from, and that the kids and the adults belong to the same group and they're given to an entirely different group. So we're taking, like, say, from Indonesian to, say, American, for example, which is not really a, but so you see where I think that this would actually need to be redefined entirely.
No, I think E is the clearest example of genocide happening. I think that's E is these other two that I've mentioned. Like you've said, you can kind of argue intent, but this one seems pretty intentional. That
Okay.
they're like so. For example, there's a law in Florida, Florida SB 254. This grants jurisdiction of trans kids to the state. So this would empower trans agents or not trans agents, state agents, right, to remove trans minors or children of trans parents from their home or their family. You know, and also in this bill, the courts they wouldn't treat as criminal the removal of a child from one parent by another parent, even if it involves bringing a child across state lines, if it was done so to prevent gender affirming care. So we're talking about the state taking kids away from parents who may allow and consent for their child to get gender affirming care. um, they're taking it from that to someone who wouldn't, right? So we are talking about destroying in part. We're forcing youth who have been going through gender affirming care from one parent to detransition, right? Because if they get taken from their home, because their home is providing affirmation and care for them to transition, we are forcing detransition. We are destroying that aspect of them. We are detransing, if you will, those people. There's also
So
a dir-
my understanding. So let me. I don't want to get too caught up in arguing
sure,
on this because we don't have the bill in front of us to actually make the arguments. But my understanding of that bill, I believe that's the one that went around the internet and everybody was like, "Oh, Florida's going to allow you to kidnap kids even from another state, even if they're not your kids."
yeah.
And
Well, I
I
mean, your kids, but
well, there were some people that were making claims that you could actually kidnap a kid from an entirely different family,
no.
from another state, so long as you were protecting them against trans medical procedures of any kind.
A-
And
As far as
my
the state,
under, go ahead.
yeah, as far as the state lines is concerned, we're talking about divorced parents. One parent lives in another state, all that kind of stuff. Or hey, both parents live in other states, but they're divorced, right? So we're talking about one of the parents supports them in their transition, one doesn't. Or for the case of this law doesn't, right? He could just want custody or she could just want custody. They can take the kid, bring him to Florida, and as long as they, prove that they are doing so to prevent the child from getting gender affirming care, um, they can do that. So it's not like different families. It's in the same family, sort of like custody battles type stuff.
Right. And my understanding was that this is actually part of a larger issue that a number of states have some sort of shared law or something like that regarding custody battles, and
Correct.
that this is actually that what people were reading as, hey, you're allowed to take a kid from a home, and Florida's going to be totally cool with it. What was actually happening was Florida saying, okay, we will. There are certain things that we will establish jurisdiction over, and we will not exclude jurisdiction necessarily if or we cannot exclude jurisdiction just because you took the kid out. So I don't know that that necessarily gives. I've seen some arguments from people where some people have said yes, you can kind of kidnap, and other people said that's not quite actually what's going on, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. So
Well,
I don't know that's the one that we really want to hang our argument on, especially since we don't have it pulled up, or that we don't have all the other states and how it cooperates.
I'd say I've demonstrated that it is, transferring children of the group to another group, right? You're transferring a even set aside the custody battle stuff because you've already said there's kind of like misinformation out there about that. I mean,
Okay.
fine, but even in Florida, um, people who are or youth who are getting gender affirming care can be subject to being removed from their home to either the foster care system or or being wards of the state, going to another family that won't do that, right? And the bill
Are
even
trans kids the only ones that experience foster homes
well well
or
well
being
no,
removed from their home?
but they would be the only ones, as far as I know, in Florida that would be forced into the foster care system as a result of whether it be their gender identity or things like that. Yeah.
Right, right,
But also the bill. Let me just get to this real quick. Also, the bill also says someone at risk of
right.
receiving gender affirming care. So we could also argue that you know someone who is trans can no longer have custody of children because their children will be at risk of being affirmed, of receiving gender affirming care. So we are talking about whether it be the kid or the parent
Okay.
transferring children from that group to another group.
But I don't I what I'm getting at is from what I remember reading of that particular bill, I don't believe it quite establishes that it's necessarily just, hey, the kid's at risk. We can take them right out of the home. I don't believe that's what it's saying. And I've read other people who have, law degrees and have studied that and say that's also not the case. And that this is more about establishing jurisdiction when there's a custody issue. Right. And so I think
I
that's
don't
a
think it
little
makes that
different.
distinction for
That's
people
that,
in state.
that's my understanding. But that's again why I said we may want to be careful about how much we debate this particular one because we don't have the bill pulled up, and it's we try to want to maybe
I've read the bill.
wind down.
I'm quoting from the bill. I mean,
I mean, you can pull it up if you want. I mean, I think you have the option to put it on the screen, or I can find
this
it.
is 254. I can read it. Granting courts of the state temporary emergency jurisdiction over a child present in the state if the child has been subjected to or is threatened with being subjected to sex reassignment prescriptions or procedures. That has nothing to do with custody or anything.
So let me look here. I'm going to be trying to. I don't like trying to read on the fly here, but let's see. This is from Florida Senate. I don't know if that's what you're reading from.
Florida SB 254.
Yep. SB 254, treatments for sex reassignment, granting courts of this state
Yeah,
temporary
this
emergency. Oh, hold on. Granting courts of this state temporary emergency jurisdiction over a child present in this state if the child has been subjected to or is threatened with being subjected to sex reassignment prescriptions or procedure,
mhm.
providing that for purposes of warrants to take physical custody of a child. So it's for the purposes, and again, I'm trying to read this. My understanding is that this is about establishing jurisdiction so that they can, for the purpose of warrants, to take physical custody, but not necessarily automatically granting it on that basis and saying, hey, yes, if you take a child out of the home, you're good to go. Our law covers you. I don't believe that's what's going on.
I guess I would disagree with that. I think that this effectively makes trans youth or people who would be at risk of receiving gender affirming care from like a trans parent or something. It essentially makes them wards of the state. I mean, they can exercise these emergency powers as however they like.
We'll have to disagree on that because I mean, we're just going to sit here and argue over what the bill says.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to read it on the fly. Like I did not have this one kind of queued up and kind of prepared, maybe a couple notes written down or anything like that. But there was a particular article, and I'll try to dig it up.
But even if I can concede, even if it is just about custody battles, that you are transferring the children from an affirming household to a non-affirming household regardless,
Okay, so we'll
even
go
if
with
it's
that.
just in custody battles.
So let's go with that because the there are two cases. There are two things that can happen. You can go from your biological home. You can go that from there to your foster home, right?
Mhm.
Okay. You can also go from, like, say, your mom to your dad, or your dad to your mom, right? Basically,
Mhm.
one parent to the next, right, in a custody battle. So those are the reasons generally those are the outcomes that are going to happen when a child is removed from the home,
Right.
right? So any child that is removed from the home is forcibly transferred from one group to the next. And there have been, say, Black children who have been removed forcibly from their home, and they have been put into foster home with white families.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
I believe that there was no intent anymore to eradicate Black children than necessarily eradicate trans people in this particular case. Because now we're talking about the group, because we're talking about the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. And I don't think they're trying to destroy a group, even in part. Because again, we go back to, I think that people are actually trying to protect children. That is their intent. Whether they're right or wrong doesn't matter. That's, I think, their intent.
I think the topic of you brought up transferring Black children to white families, as a form of like protecting them or whatever. Not to get too off topic, but I would say that there is also a cultural genocide, at least of African American people. There has been since the founding of this country.
Okay, so
Um,
that will be a topic for
that's a different
something
topic.
else.
Yeah, yeah. That's why I didn't want to bring it up.
Not getting into
But
that.
like I don't even know what I was going to say. I just think we're getting into the weeds of this,
A
and
little bit, but I think that if you're gonna follow Article 2 here, to
Mhm.
establish what is and is not a genocide, you absolutely need to clearly show intent to destroy in whole or in part. And I don't believe that any of these five can be shown that's what's happening, because you have too many other things that are going on alongside of it, right? So you have things like it's only being applied to youth, which we've kind of established, like, hey, there is a question of, can youth properly consent? There is a question of whether or not medical care, medical practitioners are necessarily doing the job that are making the proper decisions. And that is not something that's new. So this is not like some new question that we're applying to trans kid. I mean, I argued the same thing for ADHD. And I said, look, you're overprescribing. And I think Marcus said that earlier. And I think there's been plenty of other things that have been overprescribed or treatments. The crazy woman, Dr. Lena Wen, she wrote an entire book on the topic of how doctors overprescribe and get things wrong all the time, right?
but
And how,
are we banning ADHD medication for people that have
well, we
ADHD?
we made it we did make it a black box medication, and we did make it harder to get. So when I went to try to get it, so when I tried to get it early on when I was like in my 20s, like I went and there was a woman that was basically sitting with her back to me, and she was typing on a keyboard, and she was asking me questions, and I would say things, and she literally never turned around and looked at me, right? And I was like, that's really weird.
But
And then she handed me my medication. Scroll forward in my early 40s, yeah, somewhere around there, maybe late 30s. I tried to get it. It literally took me a year to get it because they had changed the process because of over medication.
right, and what I would say is if they are doing what they're doing with ADHD medication, which is making it harder to get, rather than just outright banning it, then that wouldn't be, a case for genocide. But they're outright, banning it for people under um, 18. What I wanted to say earlier about the children from
Mhm.
black families to white families, stuff like that. Um, while that may be there's no law on the books that are saying in custody battles, in cases of like needing to go to foster, we're gonna take kids from a black family to a white family, but they are saying we're gonna take kids from a household that is gender affirming to one that isn't. So
Right.
that's why that
And
line
and
isn't the
and there's
same.
also there's also bills being floated that do the exact opposite.
In California, yeah, there is.
Yeah. So in California, they are forcibly transferring kids whose parents, well, I haven't read the bill,
Well,
so I may be a little ignorant on this, but they are floating the idea of forcibly taking a child from their home, from the home of a parent that will not affirm. Now, I don't know
the
if it
California
goes
bill is a little
all the
bit
way.
different than that, but
I don't know if it's hey, you need to affirm their social transition, or hey, a doctor has said that they need this medication and you're refusing. I don't know the details, but I know that they are willing to take a child from the home, and nobody's going, hey, maybe that's a bad idea. I mean, I am, but a lot of the same people who are arguing that we shouldn't take a child out of the home of an otherwise perfectly good family because they don't want to
let's
permit um, certain treatments, which again, I believe is a parent's job because I don't believe that children can consent. You see where I'm kind of going with this? I think we
I
have
see
this
what you're saying.
problem.
Yeah,
We,
I,
we
I
have this, we have the exact same problem, but I think it's actually a real problem in reverse.
right. So the one bill in California, but we're talking about other like many bills in other states that do what I'm talking about. The bill in California is different because I don't think it is doing the same thing of removing a child from one home to another, um, things like that. What I think is happening in California, and like you, I could be wrong. I haven't really read that bill, in full or done much research on it. But what I think is happening is in custody courts, they can take into account um, whether or not which parent is gender affirming. I think is the way that they're interpreting that. I don't think it is the same, but the opposite. I think it's just a little bit different. I think they are taking into account, which parent wouldn't support their child being trans and which one would.
Okay.
Um,
So, well, I mean, we'll have to leave it at
and
that.
it's just the
Neither one
one
of us
bill.
read the bill, so there's no reason for us to continue having a conversation back and forth on a bill that neither one of us have read. That would be inappropriate, because you and I both could be wrong at the same time, and
Yeah,
no
could.
reason for us to both to make fools of ourselves. Um, so let's move on to that. So I think that we've kind of walked through this genocide thing, and I don't think I don't think we're agreeing, other than D. We got one, so 1 out of 5. We're
Well,
20%.
DNA. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, DNA. You're right. You're right. My bad. So
Well, you just need one to be a genocide. You just need one.
correct, correct, and I agree to that up front. So you believe that B, C, and E are definites. A and D are not. I believe that A through E are not, because we're not establishing intent. You believe that the intent is there, and that's fine. I do want to start winding this down because it's been a while, and I don't want to take up all of your time. And the whole point of this was really to have a conversation,
Hmm.
right? And to just kind of get things out and talk about it and see where we're going. So, let me just pick a state very intentionally here. Texas. Do you find Texas to be hospitable to trans people?
Oh no, there's actually a list of states. Like several organizations have made lists of states that are hospitable to trans people.
Gotcha.
Um,
So I want
I
to
would say
play.
Texas is not.
I want to say I want to play a clip for you, and I want to kind of get your thoughts on this. And this actually
Okay.
happened in what are my notes here? This happened on March 16th this year.
Okay.
Okay. So actually relatively recent. So we're not talking about something way long ago that doesn't apply. So let me see if I can't. So I'm gonna have to, because I don't know how to. Oops, that's not what I want to do. So let's do stop the screen, and we will share the screen again, and we will do this one, and it'll probably play as soon as I click it, or maybe not. How about I click it?
But I get you have your feelings, but I don't think it's appropriate for you to call people you don't know whether they're pedophiles or not. Because what happened?
I do know.
No, sir, you don't. Because, and here's the thing that happens, Dr. Hotze. I have trans friends, I have trans staff members, I have trans members of my community, and what you do when you cause them, it's very hurtful to them.
That's what they are.
No, sir. They are not pedophiles. They are not perverts and pedophiles.
Did you do something out of the normal, out of the norm? If cutting off your penis, if taking female drugs for a man to turn yourself into a woman isn't a perversion, help me know what the word perversion means.
Dr. Hotze, this is, they're living their true selves, doctor.
That's bullshit.
That's fine. That's fine, doctor. We have a...
Dr. Hotze, we don't use that kind of language. You're excused.
Wait, so they had issue with the word bullshit, but none of the other stuff he was saying? We don't use that kind of language?
Well, no, the whole exchange, there was actually a longer exchange. I cut it because I was like, all right, we don't need to go with like the whole, like just enough to get the point across. There was actually an exchange earlier with those two gentlemen. Okay. And it only lasts like an additional minute or something like that. And trying to, there we go.
That'd be funny though, if like this guy's saying so much hateful stuff, but the word bullshit, that's too far, you know, like. Hello? Hello? Ah, okay. You got a power outage. Gotcha. Wait, so am I live? Like, y'all can hear me and not him? Let me look at the chat. I haven't looked at the chat this whole time. It's a good idea for. So if I can be heard, I believe DL has a power outage and he'll be back in a few minutes. Archie says, if you heard a popular pundit from the left say Christianity should be eradicated, your first thought would be your first thought wouldn't be maybe they say that because of Fred Phelps. I guess that's in reference to the are they being crazy or all that kind of stuff. Oh, he says continual flickers, maybe not. I guess. Well, if y'all can hear me, I guess I would finish this by saying I think that my challenge to DL was to have a good faith discussion. I think that barring a few instances, I think this was a generally a good faith discussion. As much as I disagree, and as much as I think that, as much as I think his support for banning certain things would lead to harm, I think that this discussion was generally in good faith, which was the challenge originally. So there's that. If anyone in the comments can hear me, if they can still see the stream, please do type in the chat. Or I guess I'm just looking at the YouTube chat right now. You may want to see if he gets on, we can hear you. Okay. Yeah, I'll wait a bit, but he did say continual flickers, maybe not. So I guess we'll see. This was a fun discussion overall. I had a good time. We didn't scream at each other. You know. He didn't call me a groomer. That's pretty nice. But having a home internet issue. Gotcha. That's fair. I mean, I can see why you wouldn't. Well, I can see why someone wouldn't. I could see why someone couldn't make or wouldn't make the leap to genocide. But when looking at like a variety of different definitions, like the UN definition, like the 10 stages, you can clearly see that it either it is happening or it's about to happen or any of the other issues. No, trans people aren't generally, every trans person being put into a camp and murdered. That's not happening, no. Yeah, anyways. But yeah, I'll wait a few more minutes. But thank you, though. I do appreciate that. Yeah, history will tell. I mean, history will tell. If you want to, hey, as this might be the end of the discussion, if you want to follow me on Twitter, at RealZachBritt, that's real and then ZACHBRITT. I talk about progressive issues, a lot of it having to do with trans stuff, especially of late. So yeah. I know a lot of the people watching this are libertarians, so I am a libertarian socialist, so you might not find a lot of what I say to be agreeable to you, but there is that. And as much as you think I did a great job, I was pleasantly surprised by how good faith this discussion was. I thought I was going to get a lot worse sort of debate tactics than what I got. I was really pleasantly surprised. That's a credit to DL. As much as I disagree with his positions on this issue, I think that the discussion was in good faith. Yeah, I'll wait a few more minutes, and then if he's still having internet issues, I think I'll just call it. Damn, we went 2 hours and 26 minutes. Go ahead and call it. I'm shutting down because it's raining heavy. Don't like that. Okay. All right. Good talk. Y'all have a good night.